Alrighty. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We are right at the top of the hour, and I do want to be cognizant of your time. Just to give a little preface while people are joining us, please go ahead and start downloading Map Housing Story, item number 1 in Materials Pod. We're going to be going over that, so you do have a little bit of homework. While we're getting everything queued up and ready, I'm going to go ahead and move us into the presentation room. I'm going to hand it over to our amazing panelists for the day because I'm going to sit back and learn with everybody else too. The recording has started. Your clock is going. Please take it away.
All right, great. We are thrilled to be here with you all. I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction and then what we hope to share and talk with you about today. My name is Katie Kingery Page. I'm Associate Dean in the College of Architecture, Planning and Design at Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas. With me today are my colleagues, Dr. Sushmita Rishi. She's a professor of planning, also here in the College of Architecture, Planning and Design at K-State. And my colleague, Donna Schenk-Hamlin. She is also with K-State, and she is a facilitator and leader at the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy. So to give you just a sense of what we're here to talk with you about, creativity, complexity, and comprehension, how do we address affordable housing? What we'd like to contribute to today are our lessons learned, conversational methods applied from our affordable housing project. This was a 2-year project that spanned 2018 and 2019. It was pre-COVID, and so we were able to do a lot of in-person work. We know that that landscape has changed a lot, but many of the methods we'll describe can also transfer to virtual settings if needed. And a part of that in-person 2-year project, it included private interviews with individuals, public forums, small group study circles, all around the issue of affordable housing and seeking community solutions. So our goal was to identify from the spectrum of residents we talked with what key issues the community needed us to focus on and what solutions they most desired. Next slide, please, Craig. Thank you. So this is sort of the big overview of our project. We're giving it to you as a timeline. And what I hope you can take away here from this view is that there were really kind of these stages. Now they overlapped a bit, but we had these stages of working with community members. I also should credit and thank the Kansas Health Foundation who funded this project over the 2 years. We had another colleague who was with us during that time of the project with a group called Healthy Communities Lab. And together with that colleague, we actually had 2 separate Kansas Health Foundation grants going that helped us to do this work. This was a citizen engagement project in a nutshell. So over those 2 years, these phases included listening, which was about one-on-one interviews and meeting with small enclave groups. Sometimes people call these affinity groups, meeting stakeholders where they are. We did this before we brought in the participation into mixed public forum where diverse stakeholders and actually anyone who was at all interested, we put out a very large public call, came together to discuss these issues. And then we had an additional way of listening, which was to conduct further one-on-one interviews, starting with convenience sample and then snowballing out from there with people who had different relationships to housing, including people living unhoused. We then went into a summer of study circles. Those were citizen study circles. The format will be discussed more and a lot more detail will be given by my colleagues here. But basically, these are small groups of people who committed to studying an issue and working toward developing their own solutions as a cohort. So that's the overview. We'll bring you back to the sequence after a bit as we talk with you about the successive stages and methods that we've employed. Next slide, please, Craig.
I want to talk about a problem that we had from the very beginning. As we started these conversations informally with a grassroots group that was called Safe and Affordable Housing Action, we noticed that even from the beginning, talking about affordable housing was problematic in our community. Using that phrase, affordable housing, ignited conversations, emails in the blogosphere that exposed a lot of potential polarization. social media posts and in-person chat showed that even talking about housing itself, even that word housing, carried a lot of meanings for residents. So as project leaders, our goal was to craft forms of public dialogue and interaction that would allow all participants in a mixed group to develop what I would call a kind of a fluency, which would be an ability to hear and understand the many meanings and perspectives that diverse stakeholders bring to the conversation on that word housing. So all three of us combine a focus on community planning. My two peers are professionals with that, with a focus on community conversations. All three of us are members actually of the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy. So we have that dual focus, and we are all of us interested in having a more participatory and productive democracy that deals with these complex issues. So this question that we've got here was central to the development of our project. It asks what we need to improve our ability to converse in mixed groups. And in mixed groups among people who are accustomed to framing the housing issue from their own perspective, using their own characteristic sets of terms and expressing certain assumptions. So as members of ICDD, as I'll call it for short, Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy, we approach all community conversation projects with the additional goal of simply uncovering those assumptions that people carry into the conversation, and importantly, encouraging issue learning by everyone. You can go to the next slide. So we know from research into the methods of public conversation convening that there are pluses and there are minuses of bringing a diverse group of stakeholders together for deliberation, a mixed group. An obvious plus of mixed groups is argued by those who solicit a diverse spectrum of representatives, combining multiple perspectives and experiences to a discussion. You can say, how else can any decision we make as a community be authentic if the voices of marginalized people are not included? A potential minus is argued by those who see power disparities at work during mixed group conversations, often with some kind of assertion of expertise or professionalism that can silence the voices of those other participants who are directly impacted, often negatively impacted by decision makers. So how can we be inclusive and provide the greatest opportunity to those most often excluded from these conversations on housing? So our solution as we started this project was to delay any mixed public forum until first we had organized what we call enclave gatherings. Discussions with groups that are least likely to have access to healthy housing, which we defined together in our grassroots group, SAHA, with this logo that you see here. In my context, I define an enclave as a group, any particular group with different characteristics than the surrounding population, such as income, ethnicity, language, and so on. But by first collecting stories with interviews or more intimately scaled gatherings of these enclave groups, we were able to acquire stories that we could use as evidence later on. And we'll show how we did that in the first mixed open public forum.
Next slide, please. And so what you see here is the captured excerpts from these interviews that then my colleague Katie illustrated into posters that we set up in the first public forum. And what we're showing you here is 3 sample excerpts. The first is a property owner and community developer who owns and manages property and advocates and works for community growth and economic development. The second is a renter who has a spouse and a child and came to Manhattan from another country to earn higher education, which is a PhD, and struggles due to high cost of living. And the third is a homeowner and housing advocate who's married and works in the nonprofit and education sector and serves in local government. And so through these interviews, we captured their struggles and issues around housing that then in these excerpts we put up at the first public forum. And by distilling these stories, we hoped people would see themselves and others' legitimate experience before even sitting down at the table with them to talk. And this proved to be a successful way to engage people into thinking about housing and their own struggles with it. And we're not going to take time to do this, but I invite you all to think about what stakeholder personas you might capture with early interviews that might help you prepare for a mixed group public meeting addressing solutions to the struggles of unhoused persons as an activity. Next slide, please. We also found that there were a number of concepts and jargon that we tend to use when we think about housing and talk about housing that were important for our participants to understand before we could start a conversation. And so as an example, what you see on the screen right now is our explanation of the concept of cost burden. Now, laypersons don't often know the concept. They've heard of it, but they don't really understand what goes into it. So we used this graphic to explain to people what cost burden means. And once explained, we gave people the chance to calculate how much of their monthly income is going to rent or mortgage and use that as a way to establish a common bond. We found that almost everybody discovered that housing was a significant factor in their home economy. We invite you here to take a moment to compute your own cost burden. It's okay to not know all the numbers. You can do an approximate calculation, and we'll give you some time to calculate this, and maybe some of you can report back to us what you found your cost burden around housing is.
Forgot we had to do math today.
That you can think of. When we present this to people to help them understand cost burden, we try to include all kinds of things, like what you see there related to mobile home park fees, utilities, et cetera, because we want people to go deeper and understand that there's a lot of hidden costs to housing. But it's absolutely okay to throw in what you can come up with as a round number with what's on your mind.
So we have a couple of answers here. I'm going to broadcast the results. I don't know if everybody can now see them. And then there's a bunch of answers also in the chat. And what you'll notice is that the lowest number we have is about 23.3%, but that's just one person. Almost everybody is either 30% or above. And so a person or a household is considered to be cost burdened when that person or household spends more than 30% of income on housing. And if you spend 50% or more, then you're considered severely cost burdened. And so this is a way to start everybody thinking about how much they're spending on housing themselves and what their struggles around housing might be, even though you might not recognize that this is unusual, that spending 40% of your income on housing means that you're a cost burdened household. Okay, so next slide, please.
Okay, so imagine yourself coming into our first mixed public forum. A challenge that we had to facilitating conversations in this mixed public forum with diverse stakeholders was to establish some common base of experience as a preface to the discussions before asking people to start making claims of what's causing this or proposing solutions. So while the listening sessions featuring storytelling give us a common database for our project inquiry, the very act of storytelling was also a critical first step when we brought people together in mixed groups to experience. Now, when people arrived at the forum, they walked past the gallery of the personas that you've seen, representing a variety of diverse perspectives on affordable housing. But then at each table, we had specific group seating assignments that were designed to maximize diversity. We had trained facilitators and trained recorders at each table. There were about 11 tables of 8 to 10 people. And we had done our homework. We really reached out and did one-on-one recruiting to make sure that we would get that mix of, you might say, sort of supply side and the consumer side, the .orgs, the .govs, the .coms, the residents, owners as well as renters into that room. And we wanted them to be not with their friends, not with their favorite groups, but with a mixed group of people. This was very important to us. Before we even began in the small groups, we asked everyone to privately collect their cost burden, what you've seen there. It was on a what you call a sort of a placemat in front of them. But we also asked them to agree to a set of ground rules. ICDD calls these principles of civic discourse, and we do this for all public forums. It's been well established in the literature on public deliberation that getting a group of strangers to agree at the outset to at least aspire to a higher quality conversation does increase the potential for satisfaction and for production in the interaction. Facilitators offer these as suggestions. Then they solicit from everybody other ground rules that might be helpful. Then they ask all of the participants for their permission to remind the group if they find them straying from those agreed to ground rules. This is a really important practice. It empowers the facilitator, and it also allows people to realize that this is a special kind of conversation, and it's a joint attempt to demonstrate better conduct than would happen if it was just free range conversations. So we'll describe a little bit about what it was like once we got through those stages here.
So the images that you see here relate to that first public forum that we showed you in the timeline. Now remember, we'd already visited with people in smaller enclave neighborhood and different groups. So we'd had a chance to really get some grassroots support from people to come to this. In addition, we did a lot of work with students in our area, college students. So a survey had actually gone out to them prior to this. And we used every form of media that we could to increase participation in this forum. We did have, thanks to that Kansas Health Foundation grant, we had the ability to have childcare available at this forum. And we also had the ability to offer food because it was in an evening time when folks would be having dinner. So with all of those things in place, we were able to attract about 90 to 100 people, which made for a really robust discussion. So as you can see here, we began with helping people to use storytelling, as Donna was talking about, to first explore their own story, kind of like we asked you to look at on that PDF, My Housing Story. And we use that as a way to not only bring people into themselves, but also to help them listen respectfully to others and hear other people's housing stories. We did not have a panel of experts or talking heads up speaking during this. It was about people listening and learning to one another. And then we brought forth the community participants' findings and created sort of a gallery of those findings, which you see our student assistants pinning up there at the top. Another point that I should make is if you look at these tables of people, we were quite intentional in mixing up who was sitting together. So we didn't just let, for example, all of those who are part of the landlords group in town, they didn't sit together at a table as a group. We didn't have students who are renters or low income or older adult renters. We didn't have them sitting together. We purposely had these homogenous tables of people so that they would listen to one another and hear different experiences. Out of this forum, we offered an opportunity to join the summer citizen study circles, and we had great results with that. We signed up 14 people who were willing to devote a little bit of time over the summer to studying these issues. So now, if you'd go to the next slide, please, Craig. I think everyone has access to this PDF through our documents here, and Craig's been putting some information in the chat on how to get access to that if you haven't opened it. But you can also just follow along here from the slide. What I'd like to do is take a few minutes to demonstrate with you and work with you to show you this method of story solicitation that we used. So in circles, each group had an assigned facilitator who asked them the scripted questions that are on the second page of the PDF if you've downloaded that. But people were first given a little time just to think about their own housing story, that journey. So for you all here today, maybe you had a chance to look at this and map your housing story prior to this webinar. Maybe you didn't, and that's perfectly okay. But imagine that you were going to sit down in a small group or with another peer in a pair and share that story with your neighbor. I'd like you just to think through your own story for a few minutes. And I want to note that while this map is limited to the contiguous United States, we know that doesn't encompass everyone's housing story. Maybe for you, an important piece of your story is moving to the US, or maybe you don't even live in the US now. It may be somewhere else entirely. So please feel free to begin your story where it really begins. And you can make notes if you like on a piece of paper and think through where were those key places. So what we asked people to do was to mark where they had lived, use arrows if they were coming from a place outside of the map to show that. And we also then asked them to list it on the right side of the page. We asked them to use years to say, in this particular year, I moved to this place, and to give us a little bit of the why. Why did you move? What prompted you to move to each of these locations? We gave people examples because we wanted to help them loosen up on, what was the reasoning. All of us have our own reasons. Maybe it's because a housing situation was really substandard, poor conditions. Maybe it was too expensive. Maybe it wasn't convenient to work or some other reason. Maybe you needed to move to be closer to family. Those were the kind of things we were hoping to get at and allow our participants to reveal. So I believe that we do have a poll question coming up. And it's in the chat. Oh, thank you. Excellent. Hold on. I want to be sure that I'm seeing that. Awesome. Thank you very much, Craig. So what we're asking is, what were your first 3 housing moves? Where did you move from? And where did you move to? Why did you move? And I'm seeing that some responses are coming in here. So please, let's take a couple more moments if anyone would like to share. I'm thankful for those who have already shared, and we'll talk a little bit about these responses as a few more come in. Great, I see several people are typing. While some more of you may be entering bits of your housing story, it's a longer journey. I know it's a complex story, and we might just be getting a little snapshot. But let's reflect on some of those. So I'm seeing that Corey's talked about their first house in 1996, later moving to another house, talking about how their housing choices related to the housing crisis, talking about needing to sell their house and move into a rental property. These are all the kinds of things that we know influence our choices. Denise is talking about moving from Corpus Christi to Dallas, marriage influencing a decision. moving to other cities within Texas, having another major life event, and moving to another part of Texas, job-related moves. Dana's talking about being in North Carolina, beginning in Winston-Salem. It sounds like maybe going back to childhood, talking about a major family event of a divorced parents, and then moving from High Point to Boone. Hey, I know those places. Those are mountain places up there. Going to college at Boone, Bowling Green, and then moving to various places related to education, it sounds like. Vanessa is talking about a move in 2007, Brownsville to Austin. Vanessa's putting in a few more moves that were within Texas, it sounds like, and had to do with relationship and family needs and changes. Billy's putting in several different moves and across the world as well, including Bosnia in those moves. Marliza talking about moves in Texas related to education, reasons related to relationships, partners, completing education and maybe moving to other places after that. Crystal similarly putting in some information about living and moving with a family of origin, with parents, and then to other places. Now, I wish that I could go through every one of these. I know we're going to run short on time if I do, but I do want to thank all of you for sharing a little glimpse of your housing story. And so you can imagine, as we were using this technique, and it was one of the first things that those forum participants did as they sat down together in a homogenous group where you might be sitting with someone who is actually living unhoused, and you might be sitting with someone who owns rental property, and maybe also with a community planner who's an advocate for housing, that people we put them in a situation where they had to hear and listen to one another's stories. And we found that it developed a great deal of interest, an ability to cross over and not just hear their own point of view. So I'll leave you here with this question: how might you use a similar exercise when you hold public discussions on housing loss? I think we can go to our next slide now, Craig.
I want to add that the other questions that we asked them to consider after they had heard each other's story, what would you advise to somebody else who is going to move, were kind of honed in on our community. So we actually had a Manhattan map that they looked at. And as they talked about what they were looking for as they moved around in Manhattan and what they were not finding in their searches for housing, led to the final question: well, what would you advise of somebody else who is undertaking this? So we established the common ground, and then they were beginning to start deducing what's wrong. We didn't just start by saying, oh, what needs to be done with housing in Manhattan? We started with the stories and then helped them to deduce some original ideas from those stories themselves. So getting back to the project timeline, that was in the phase in which we had the first public forum. The result of that, as Katie mentioned, was that we recruited 2 groups of 7 each to dedicate time, lunch hour or Saturday morning, in 2 parallel groups over 3 events in the summertime. What we really wanted people to do was dedicate themselves to learning about the experience of cost burden and discover what other communities were collectively doing to address it. Next slide. So in our first summer of study circles, we began by asking what people hoped they would learn throughout the summer. And at the end of each of those 3 sessions, we asked people what questions they had. The team would then research, bring documentation back to them at the next study circle for them to discuss. So we were learning not just facts about housing conditions or proposed remedies, but we were all learning together how to listen to one another and to listen to ourselves as we considered the meaning of this joint endeavor. So each session involved not just issue learning, but learning how to study and interact together. Let's go to the next slide. essentially, we needed to begin by uncovering some of our assumptions. Exploring what we mean by home and housing was one exercise we did. And I had been to a restorative justice conference where I learned about a method that would help us learn to take turns and listen carefully to each other. It was called the talking stick method. I don't know how many of you have used this, but in a small circle with our 7-member group, we asked participants to first write down one word on a paper plate. We were serving them sandwiches. And so we had plenty of paper plates. Write down one word on a paper plate that came to mind when we said the word home. This was our first exercise. Each person took turns after they had written this word down, put the paper plate back in their lap, took turns with what we call a talking stick. Whoever holds the talking stick has the floor and everybody else is silent. And then that person voluntarily passes the talking stick on to the next person who answers the question, what word comes to your mind when we say the word home? And in the first circle around the table, nobody comments. The person who holds the stick just elaborates a little bit on what associative words came up when we said the word home. But then we went back a second time around in which, having heard what other people said, they could say a little bit more. And this is a very interesting exercise in listening and also thinking about what you said in comparison to what other people have said. Then we repeated the exercise by saying, what words are evoked when we say housing? And we practice the same thing. It's a very, very interesting comparison that resulted from that. We'll show you right now and you'll be able to do it. We can go to the next slide. Yeah.
Think about the first 3 words that come to your mind when you think about home, and you can write those words up in the poll that's showing up on the screen. And so we'll give you a few minutes to fill this in, and then we'll see what we come up with. So as you can see, these results that your fellow participants are putting in, we see there's a lot of safe, warm, comfort, love, family. Values and words that reflect the feelings of home, right? We'll take a few more minutes maybe, and then move on to the next one. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. And so now that we've thought about home, I invite you to now think about housing. And there'll be a poll coming up on the screen, and we ask you to write up what 3 words come to mind when you think about housing. Mm-hmm.
That's quite a shift in words.
So So there's, as Greg pointed out, there's a shift in words. There's also a lot more about the physicality of housing itself. This is also where we're seeing more about expense, about affordability, about access, perhaps. And so if we compare these two, that would be the next step in our exercise. We would see how these two are actually different and similar, and why. And try to have a conversation about why these two invoke different words and different values in our minds. So home is more about safety, love, family, comfort, warmth, stability, whereas housing is more about cost. It's expensive. It's, affordability is a thing, accessibility is a thing. It provides shelter. It's necessary. And so there's a contrast between housing and home that actually, in some ways, I would say also demonstrates some of the issues that we have around housing, because home and housing are so different for us, and they're not the same thing, when essentially I would say they should be, because every house should be a home. And so we're going to move on to our visual strategies next.
So another technique we used as we depart or move forward from that housing and home exercise, another technique we used to get at people's values about housing and home was a very visual technique, because we know that a lot of times values are unspoken, they're implicit or assumed, or maybe not even articulated in an internal sense, much less outwardly. And so we used a technique that comes from the world of education, aesthetic development, and museum studies. And this technique is called visual thinking strategies. It's a very deceptively simple technique. So really, in a nutshell, a facilitator who has practiced this and has developed the ability to just be a blank sort of objective reflector to the group they're working with asks a few key questions. And you see those questions up here on the screen in front of you. What's going on in this picture? What do you see that makes you say that? And what more do we see? And so we're going to demonstrate for you as a group. I'm going to lead Sush and Donna in some VTS with an image, and then we're going to ask you to do some VTS with us. And what I'd like you to notice from thinking about leading these conversations in your own community is that it's really important for the facilitator to maintain that neutrality. Because the moment that I start to affirm someone's answer, or maybe ignore someone's answer or not show them I agree with it, the moment I apply my own sort of value layer, it's going to shift the conversation. And so you'll see me I think you will notice me trying not to do that. We'll show you what we mean. Let's go ahead to the next slide, Craig. Great. Donna, Sush, what's going on in this picture?
I see a family of, I would say, African American. I think they're Americans. And it looks like it's a summer afternoon and they're just hanging around on their porch.
Yeah, it seems like it's an older picture. It's not contemporary. And they're related to each other in some way, but they're almost reminds me of like when somebody's been reprimanded, or because the body language and how none of them is actually looking at each other. They're looking in different directions, even though they're in the same space. And then the structure itself seems to be a house. but it's not in very good condition. You can see from the condition of the flooring, the condition of the siding, that it hasn't been kept up. So um, deduce or suspect that they're probably poor. Yeah.
This is a great, oh, look at me doing it. Look at me saying this is a great starting place. So that's the kind of objectivity. I'm missing my objectivity. Instead, what I'd like to do is really recap a little bit and ask Donna and Sush what they see that makes them say some of these things. So I'm going to go back to your comment, Donna. You mentioned that you believe this is a family and that they're hanging out in the summertime. And maybe Donna was saying that because the foliage appears to look like it's a green time of year and it appears sunny. Maybe because some of the people in the image have their arms bare, so you might think it's a warmer type of time. You mentioned family. Now, what makes you say that?
Well, it's father, mother. I'm identifying the classic family. Male father, female mother, 2 boys, 2 girls figures, and I want to say something about what Sush said. She noticed that the conditions of the house looked poor, and I was distracted rather by the beauty and the quality of this dress that the woman in the foreground is wearing and saying, wow, that is. And her mom looks like she's a seamstress. She's working on something right now. The boys are dressed farm boy kind of outfits, overalls, but look at that girl's dress. And then I'm asking myself the question, if this was an African American family in the South, and I'm guessing South, that's a wild guess, they kept that place beautifully and they kept the daughter beautifully clothed, but there was something in the structure that would not permit them to have a house that was any nicer than this quality.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to some of that in a second, Donna. And I'm first going to ask Sush a bit about what she sees that made her say some of the initial comments. Mm-hmm. Sush had mentioned, similarly to Donna, that this appears to be a family group. And Sush had specifically zeroed in on what she felt could be going on in the moment. I think your words, Sush, were that maybe someone had been reprimanded. Mm-hmm. What makes you say that?
Well, they're all in the sort of porch space, but if you see the 2 standing women or girls, they're looking like outward, right? And then the 2 boys, one of them that's facing us is looking kind of at what the lady is doing, but not at her, but at like what she's doing. And then the other one's just looking like straight ahead. And then the lady and the man are also not looking at each other. So they're not engaged with each other. That like makes me feel or think about, well, because if you're in the same space and you're like talking to each other, you tend to look at each other. Why would you not look at each other? Right? Like what would happen to prevent you from doing that?
So Sush is really zeroing in, to recap a little bit, zeroing in on the gaze, the direction of the gaze between the people on the porch, whether they're looking at each other or not, looking maybe sort of past each other. And I think Sush is also looking at the facial expressions. I want to come back to some of Donna's comments. Donna mentioned that she was seeing different aspects of aesthetics or beauty, of different aspects of wealth or poverty. And I think, Donna, that you had mentioned you were seeing this beauty and care and attention, and we could even think of it as a kind of wealth in the girl's clothing, the girl standing on the left side of the image. And then you had also reflected on the mother and thinking that perhaps the mother had made the clothing because we see her in the act of what appears to be sewing or making more clothing. And Donna, you had mentioned, I think, too, a bit about the state and the condition of the porch. Sush, you did as well. Let me ask, what is it in the image that makes you reflect on that condition of the porch? Either of you. What do you see that makes you say that?
It, I mean, it could just be the angle of the image, but actually no. If you kind of look at where the column goes into the porch, you can tell that there's a little bit of the porch is kind of not level. And just the edges of the boards seem to be, there seems to be a lot of wear and tear. But
Yeah.
if you contrast that with the clothes that particularly the women in the image are wearing, but even the older gentlemen, like their clothes are like clean, they seem to be, newish. So this is it seems to be people who take pride in appearance a little bit and invest in it. So then why is the porch the way that it is? So that kind of contrasts a lot and makes me think that there's something, that either you don't have the money or it doesn't belong to you or something else is going on.
We're going to
Yeah.
stop ourselves here because we want to leave time for you all to do some visual thinking strategies as well. Billy had put in the chat that he thought this, I'm sorry, he, she, or they thought this was a really fascinating exercise. And it is great because it's flexible. I just want to mention that, Billy. We've done this with first graders who are 6 years old. We've done this with people across the lifespan, people from all kinds of backgrounds. And you can see how it doesn't take long for people to open up and really start to see things. And they turn each other on to more things in the image, which is a really cool quality of this. So let's go on to the next slide, Craig, and we are going to ask our group here these same questions. What's going on in this image? Craig, I can't remember if we're, yes, thank you. Craig put our question in there. We'll do this in the chat. And thank you, Craig. So what do you see? What's going on in this image? Feel free to just enter what you see in the chat. Okay, I'm going to take a few comments as they come in. So Denise is saying that it looks like the aftermath of a storm or a disaster. And I think that Denise may be referring to some of the rubble that's to the left of the figure in the image and behind the figure in the image. Another person has mentioned, Craig has mentioned that he sees a distressed woman, possibly after a storm. I think Craig is zeroing in or focusing in on the facial expression of the person, but also on what's happening in the setting. And Craig is saying maybe that is a sense of distress, the situation and the person's face. Billy is saying it looks like the woman could be on the phone, not sure. So Billy is looking at the action of the figure in the center of the image and what they're doing. Dana's saying an Eastern European, based on clothing, in front of a destroyed building, talking on the e-phone. And at this point, Dana's focused on that figure again. And I might ask Dana, what about the clothing makes you say that, Eastern European? And we could keep the conversation going that way. And please feel free to add that in the chat, Dana. Benjamin is writing, it looks like the wreckage of a tornado or something. So I believe Benjamin is also focused, as some others were, on what's happening to the left and in the background behind the figure. Paula says, person is updating or reaching out for help after a storm or disaster. And so I might ask Paula this question too, of what makes you say that, Paula? We can see the condition happening around the figure in the image, but Paula's saying something quite specific, that the person, it may have just immediately happened and they are reaching out now. So I'm curious what gives Paula that sense of immediacy, or it has just happened. So I might ask, what makes you say that, Paula? And please, by the way, do feel free to keep typing in here if you'd like to. Vanessa has added using a brick from the rubble to lean on and talk on the phone. And Vanessa is talking about what we see the figure's elbow leaning on. It appears to be a similar color to some of the material of the rubble that's around. Mary has noted an older Anglo woman talking on a phone who is sitting among a lot of rubble, like a home that's in pieces. She's dressed in a coat and a hoodie, so it's likely cold. So Mary's giving us a lot of that follow-up question info. Why do you say that? Mary's explaining to us that it is because of what the figure is wearing that she thinks it might be cold. Dana is coming back and answering my question of what makes you say that about the figure looking like maybe Eastern European. It looks like she is wearing a wool coat, which makes me think it's a colder environment, and she has some Eastern European facial features. So Dana's referring to the woman, it appears to be a woman in the image, and the facial features of the individual. Marlisa has written, to the right, there's a building that's intact, but it still looks a little older. And Paula has written, the look on her face makes me think she's currently distressed and leaning, which seems like body language when someone is struggling with something currently. That was Paula responding to me saying, what makes you say that about it being an immediate moment? Because Paula had noted that the image looks to her as though someone's reaching out for help or giving an update. And so Paula is reflecting on the body language of the individual, maybe the facial expression too, which certainly has a sense of some type of distress, leaning forward. Thank you. That was a great, I mean, y'all were forthcoming with so much about this image. And I just want to note, if you consider using some kind of an image-based exercise with other groups, one thing that we try not to do is give away a lot about the intention of the artist or the provenance and history of the image. The one that you saw Donna and Sush and I work with was a very famous Gordon Parks photo. But I wouldn't have introduced it to the group and given them the entire background of the series of photos or anything like that, because that might actually inhibit the people I'm talking with from bringing their own interpretations to this. And it is not, well, how can I say it? It's not an art history exercise. Whereas it's fascinating to know the history of an image, what we want to know is what are people bringing to it in this moment. So a couple more responses had come in here. Belinda had said it looks like a disaster from a storm due to the destruction. And the trees do not have leaves, which could have been stripped, or perhaps indicating the weather is colder. And she interprets this to be an older lady who is calling for help. And so if you see, when I'm doing my job right, as someone facilitating this exercise, I am making it clear that it's someone's reflection or interpretation of this, and leaving it open that Sush or Donna or myself or Craig or Marlisa could have a totally different interpretation of this image. It's a deceptively simple thing, which gets us to see that there is ambiguity, complexity, and difference of opinion as we view really anything. Craig can put a question in the chat. We could use any image. Yes, you could. I have done this with my students using all kinds of images, and it's been really fascinating what has come out of that. All right, let's go to the next slide.
Okay, that got corrupted for some reason. Yeah.
You know what? That's okay. I can talk through it.
Got inverted a little
we
wrong.
will not worry. We're leaping into another phase of our timeline of this project, and it was the phase I described to you earlier as the second listening phase, where we did further one-on-one interviews with people. And in the course of doing those interviews, and we did again try to have very diverse sample of people with very different relationships to housing, everything from people who own housing, people who own homes, people who rent housing, people who live unhoused, people who are housing advocates. We tried to collect a very diverse group of interviews. And then we analyzed the content of those interviews. And we were interested in several different things. One of those being whether there was evidence of cost burden, and if so, how the person's experience or story, what their reflection was on living with that cost burden. So we'll go through just a couple of these, and I'm going to invite Sush to jump in and talk about Karen.
Okay. So we're just going to give you maybe 4 samples of how we... So the first is Karen. Of course, these have been anonymized. These are not real names. And so Karen is an LGBTQ renter who's living with disability. The common themes in their interviews with us was low wages and barriers to housing qualification. And you can see here the things that they're talking about. First about how, as a gay couple, you have to consider whether your landlord is going to be okay with that because you don't want to have to hide that. And so that might become a barrier to qualifying for housing and being able to access housing. And then as um, particularly a female identifying gay person, they're also more vulnerable to violence. And so where the house is also becomes important for them. Our second sample is Yuri, who's an older adult renter who reflected a lot upon his experiences living unhoused. Some common themes from their interviewers: the need for low-income senior housing, as well as the reality of being unhoused or being homeless. They talked about their rent, that their landlord kept raising their rent by $15 a month every other year, and that made where they were currently living unaffordable, and therefore they became unhoused. Um, and they were now living in below market rates senior housing, and that before they moved into this housing, they were living out of their van with his dog for about 5 years. Katie?
And what he reflected on dominantly was the reality of homelessness. He talked about how people treated him. He said there are different kinds of people, some who treat him with pity, some who try to help. There's people who are indifferent. And then he also related some stories of people who were outright cruel, more than unsupportive, cruel and aggressive and violent. And he talked about that, about someone, a memory of that, sleeping in his vehicle and someone kicking the car door, calling him, terrible names. And he was really reflecting on the kind of trauma and intensity of interactions with others that living unhoused made a reality in his life. We can go to the next slide. We talked with Will, who is a renter who shares a house with roommates, living in a kind of a doubled up way to avoid cost burden. And the themes that came forward from his interview were low employment wages and part-time employment being major factors in that cost burden. So he talked about that at his friend's house, where many people were living, he could just pay $200 a month. And because of debt like student loans, that was an amount he could afford, is $200 a month. He talked about other expenses he had, the reasons that he couldn't move into a different situation, a different kind of housing. And he said, even though he has a whole lot of different jobs, he described them, these different jobs that he had, at the end of the month, he always just feels like he's running around with his head cut off, living paycheck to paycheck, and not really able to get ahead of those debts and bills. And so that was his reality and why he was living doubled up. Before we go to the next image, I want to just mention why these were useful to us in the process of community dialogue. When we were in the citizen study circle phase of the project, we had a study circle group where some participants were asking, they had an experienced cost burden in our community, and they weren't sure if it was a real thing. They thought maybe it was something that only students experience. We live in a college town, so they thought, well, maybe it's only students. And they were conjecturing potentially students like to live, 8 to a residence or something. So is this really an issue? And the usefulness of this was that we were able to provide them with a summary of these one-on-one interviews to say, here are some real life experiences that you might want to consider that are from people right here in your community who are living with cost burden. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So through that exploration of meaning that we have talked through, first with word association, values of home and housing, using images to open up our values that might be deep-seated or unseen, all of these exercises in listening that we did, these allowed us, while we were reading about what lots of different communities are doing to address affordable housing, to examine ourselves as a community and examine our assumptions about what we know and what we perceive. So I'm going to talk just briefly, I'm going to identify the solutions that these study circles came up with, and then I'm going to pass the baton to Sush to talk a little bit about how those circles were encouraged to narrow to come to some kind of actionable solution. She'll discuss the criteria of those. So I'll just highlight quickly, and I think this slide may also have lost some
it's missing
of its pizzazz.
Yeah.
It's missing a few things. So let me read out what should be in those yellow bubbles. We'll focus on that. What you should see in the top yellow bubble is the term community trust fund, and the middle bubble, neighborhood revitalization, and then the bottom yellow bubble that has its words rental inspection. These are the three things that our community members narrowed toward. I'll pass it to you, Sush.
And so working with word associations and descriptions of visual interpretation helped us basically narrow down onto these three solutions. We use particular criteria that we asked our study circles to focus on to come to these three solutions. And so those criteria was, would it increase the number of people who feel at home in Manhattan? Would it result in real improvement in residents' lives? Would it empower underrepresented groups? And that it should have clear targets for implementation, and it should help improve the quality as well as maybe monitor the quality of the Manhattan housing stock. So what was really happening is that what you see in the white, you can't see all of the words in the white. Those were the words that we had ended up with. Using those words and the words in purple, we came up with these criteria and asked the study circles to use those criteria to narrow down on three solutions. And so based in these criteria, the three solutions were as what Katie had identified, which is setting up a community land trust, focusing on neighborhood revitalization, and creating a rental inspection program. Okay, Donna?
Okay, think back to the timeline. We had a spring activity of bringing a mixed group of people together. Out of that, we had commitments from 2 teams of 7 to commit in the summertime in study circles. Then we brought them together into a merged group of 14, and they identify these 3 criteria here. I mean, these 3 focus points. We kind of call these buckets. We said, we're not offering you a specific articulation. We're saying this is a category of solution that we think the city of Manhattan should be focusing on. But we decided to follow that up with the second spring having another public forum to affirm and explore with a wider public those 3 choices. But before we did that, and in the intervening winter, we were holding public seminars, bringing in people from other communities who were addressing these 3 areas. So we had people from Lawrence, we had people from Emporia, Kansas, both of them university towns, and we were extending the idea of community learning, but with open invitation public seminars, you might say, and they were well attended by members of city staff, elected officials, and people who had been in the study circles, or people who just learned about it and said they were curious and wanted to come. So community learning was continuing up until the second spring, the second public forum that we held. Now this time, as we prepared the invitations and focused again on strategically getting the right people to represent all the aspects of the housing system, we were looking at civic groups, government, nonprofits, whose missions were engaged with housing, along, of course, with representative residents, the consumer side of the public, to attend this meeting. Let's go to the next slide. And the way we designed this second public forum was, in the first half, we held what's called a World Cafe oriented meeting. It's a walkabout where individuals rotated among tables hosted by those nonprofit organizations, those organizations dedicated to housing. And they had been told that we wanted them to put out their mission statement and talk to anybody who comes by the table about what their values are. Then the other people who walked around would note down on a card what values language they were hearing from these organizations and consider what their own primary values were. Think back to the earlier discussion where we had the exercise with values language, when we solicited 3 words that they thought about with home and housing. Well, the language that we were soliciting was, what do you value here? And what are you hearing from the mission statements described by these organizations are their primary values? During a break, we had 2 student graduate assistants who compiled the language, both that people wrote down as visitors to the tables and the language that they got from the table hosts, into a word cloud. And this was representative of what key terms were most concerning, most desirous, most topical in housing from that World Cafe session. Let's go to the next slide. When we had finished with that first phase of people just circulating and getting acquainted with the different organizations that have a mission dedicated to housing, we then sort of test drove those 3 solution areas by saying, okay, you can now choose what interests you. Go to a group that will have a facilitator asking people their questions about what needs to happen to make this theme into a actionable program. So these in-depth discussions were designed to first raise questions, then solicit a commitment to further investigation in a second set of study circles. We're now at the end of spring 2, and we're looking at the next summer. A second set of study circles would be participated by those people who chose to advocate for this solution. And we were, by the end of this second half of the forum, outlining what steps might need to occur in order to achieve change in our community with this particular solution bucket, you might say. So that was our second public forum. It generated a less, what should I say? It was a more mixed turnout for the successive study circles. Word got out. Advocates who were really interested in rental inspections, in a housing trust fund, or in neighborhood revitalization were welcome to come to lunch meetings. Generally, we always had food thanks to this grant, and they were able to study further, getting to the point where they would be identifying groups that could advocate. So in the second series of summer study circles, we were actually beginning to flesh out who are the community actors that are going to be needed to make this happen. What are their power relationships? what are the points of convergence or even resistance that we might encounter as we pursue this solution, and where to begin. You can imagine with neighborhood revitalization, that particular study circle group was saying, okay, what's our priority inside the map of Manhattan? Where do we think we need to begin our work? Interestingly, when it came to the community housing trust, there was an evolving change in focus from a community trust fund to a community land trust, which were different animals. We had a Lawrence, Kansas housing trust executive director come and give a lecture to us on the difference between a trust fund and actually establishing a nonprofit community land trust. So there was learning going on, and people were saying, well, what do we have to find out first? Do we have to get the money? Do we have to identify a nonprofit group that's going to take on this new form of shared equity? And when it came to the rental inspections to improve code enforcement, there were groups evolving as this project proceeded. A group called Renters Together, an alliance of tenants, was holding their own regular meetings to educate tenants and to give them the tools of advocacy. So that generation of community conversations actually assisted, but it was not required in order to activate many students who are passionate about the low quality of their tenants, and another group called Northview Rising, which was a neighborhood alliance that was evolving in response to the question of how do we improve the conditions of our housing in our particular district of Manhattan. By the end of that summer, the second, I wouldn't say informal, but more flexible study circles, we were reaching the end of the life of our project as far as the Kansas Health Foundation grant. But we were able now to pull together the data from our study circles, from the whole sequence of interviews, public forums, and working groups, and give a report to the city of Manhattan. What proceeded and is still continuing today out of that process were a series of new coalitions being developed and initiatives started. And I'll just give an example that I experienced because I was a facilitator for the summer study group called Housing Trust Funds. Because the group was still very diverse, we didn't have to engineer that. We had people on what you would call the supply side and on the consumer side in that group. There was a shift.
Prototyping net positive homes. So that means that the home produces more energy than it consumes. It included in that partnership our local Habitat for Humanity. Also in that partnership, Advocates for Solar Power, a group, a local group, Flint Hills Renewable Energy Cooperative, is a part of that partnership. And what they've been able to do, they've actually built already one demonstration house in our community, and they're working on a second. These are homes that are at least 2-bedroom, 2-bath, sometimes a little bit larger, and they're able to be built for about $130,000, as well as not having the costs of utilities due to being net positive. So this is a type of affordable housing solution, you could say. The group is working toward being able to have the capacity to help our community start a housing trust fund. That has not happened yet. I don't see Donna back yet. Do you, Sush?
No, she's in the chat. She's saying we can't see her, but she's here.
Oh, she's here.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Donna, please feel free to put anything in the chat that you'd like me to mention that I maybe haven't yet about workforce solar housing. And let me just say that the thought of a housing trust fund, this is something that many communities have, generally administered through a non-governmental organization. Donna has done quite a bit of research and has spoken with people around the country who are working with housing trust funds. An incredible amount of potential in terms of affordable housing, because the equity of the land stays in the trust. And Donna has written in the chat, still working, she is actively working with the Workforce Solar Housing Project and others to develop a community land trust. But importantly, I like this suspense, Donna. But importantly, let's see what's coming next.
The sales tax.
Here we are. We came together to pass a sales tax dedication to workforce housing initiatives. That's right. Absolutely. Making some funding available through public sources for workforce housing development. Great. Very important. I am going to head on to our next slide, Craig. And in the balance of our time, I think we have about 15 minutes, a little bit less left. We would really like to open up and hear from you. We'd love to know, what are you advocating for locally in your communities? Or perhaps you're not an advocate, but relate to the housing system in another way. What do you wish people were advocating for in your community? Those two questions. What are you advocating for, or what do you wish people were advocating for? And then we hope we can talk a little bit about how we sustain these conversations. So please feel free to respond to the poll. Craig, do you think we can also open up at maybe in the last 5 minutes for some open question and answer with microphones? Okay, great. Craig's the best. We got to thank Craig. He's been excellent with this
Of course.
webinar support.
Yeah. Maybe we don't need the presentation anymore, so we could kind of get out of the presentation and just see people if people want to, you know. Okay.
Yeah. Here, let me move some things around. We can open everything up. I'm just
And
going
I
to go
see
ahead
that people
and
are
yes, let me get this recorded.
answering the poll and putting in some thoughts here. I don't know if I can scroll down. Maybe I can. I'm going to try to. So I'm seeing, what are you advocating for in your community? People are writing equitable housing for LGBTQ folks, sources of income protection, reducing economic inequalities related to income. What do we wish people were advocating for? More housing that's not always determined by the market. I cannot see all of the questions, and I don't know why I can't scroll down through them. Are you able to, Sush?
No.
For all the answers is what I.
There.
Oh, okay. Let me see. Thank you, Craig. That's great.
You got to
I will let
expand the
you expand because
boxes.
you're better at
There you
that.
go.
Hey, thank you. Okay, great. So, Sush, jump in too. I'm seeing a lot of great answers in here.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of in the what do you wish people were advocating for affordable housing, rent caps, more housing for people with very low incomes and no incomes. I'm guessing against gentrification and not for gentrification. And then what are you advocating for in the community? Financial inclusion of all populations for financial stability, asset building. We're up against the neighborhood in terms of the location of our building. Somebody has shared, somebody who advocates for affordable housing for low-income families. So some common themes around housing and affordable housing.
And some great advocacy work I'm seeing in here related to supporting people to exit homelessness and helping them overcome a lot of different barriers. Yeah. Wow. Well, you sound like a fascinating group of people. We'd love to see your faces and or hear your voices if that's possible. And if you have a question or would like to bring up a point for discussion about the work you're doing, about how we can help sustain this conversation nationally and in our communities, by all means, let's talk a little bit.
So let me take us into our final room. I will turn on all webcams and mics, so be prepared for some chaos for a second. But we would like some organic conversation to happen. Okay, microphone rights, boom, boom. Attendees at the top, you're going to see your mic option is available now. You can turn that on. If you would like to show your camera is on now.
Thanks, Craig. Craig's going to open this poll on
We had one
sustaining
more
a
last poll, so
conversation.
let me bring that in for us.
Is there, oh, good. I am seeing I'm seeing people pop in here. Okay. Hi, Benjamin.
I'll just cover me up for now.
Hi, Billy.
Here, I'll cover the chat so we don't have to lose people.
Hi, Denise. Hi, Mary. Nice to see your faces.
Oh,
Donna's
Donna's
back. Vanessa, hi.
Donna, we still can't hear you. You need to reconnect your mic.
Surprise.
Cannot.
Yeah, but feel free to unmute yourselves, ask a question, comment, something you want to talk about or just want to tell us.
It's maybe, you know what, I'm just gonna, if it's okay, I'm gonna stimulate our conversation just a little bit.
Digging in our YouTube.
Going off of what one of the answers here to our poll about sustaining. Keep safe spaces open to have these types of conversation. I really think in a nutshell, that's what was the significance of the project that we undertook. And it was truly eye-opening to see what creating that safe space that included people with all kinds of relationships to housing, that didn't make them feel marginalized in a room full of power players. Creating that safe space allowed some really powerful things to evolve. Donna probably would have said another word about renters together. Can you talk, or is your mic working now, Donna? Dang it. No, we can't. We can't hear you. So Renters Together did spin out of this project, and what it is basically a tenants union. And they were very, very active for about 2 years. They were incredibly active. They had launched a legal initiative where they provided legal assistance to renters in our community on a regular basis. And we're doing some really incredible, powerful work. They're in a bit of a hiatus. I think some of their key leaders have moved out of the community. So like other grassroots organizations, ebbing and flowing. But I'm seeing some other things show up in the chat here. Space to speak openly, innovative ways to improve housing options. Yeah.
Donna, looks like your mic's back.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Sorry. I was looking at three different chats.
Would any of you like?
I want to be hearing from other people.
Would any of you like to introduce yourselves
here
and just
on what
tell
you're
us
doing,
a little bit about what you're working on,
or any questions that you have about?
Sorry, I'm doing too much right now.
So
they've been intimidated by my
somebody
experience.
has said in how do we sustain, prioritize and center voices with lived experience in our organizations and communities, which is really, really important. Follow up on this meeting. Yeah. And I think that, following up on this meeting, which is generally just, I think sustaining conversations and sustaining movements is one of those things that we've been thinking about quite a bit and trying to reflect on, because as our experience with Renters Together, but just generally since this project has ended, has been, it becomes sometimes, there's sort of this sine wave of movement around issues. And what we're really interested in is, since housing is such a big issue, how do we kind of create movement or grassroots movement that actually, even when there are setbacks, continues and continues focusing on the issue, right? Like housing hasn't, as an issue, hasn't gone away for us, uh, but we've seen sort of an ebb and flow in sort of focus on it in the community and through people who are focusing on it, even though like Donna and others have continued to work on it.
Hmm. Now you said y'all were lucky to have the grant that paid for food, but were you able to compensate financially any of the respondents to your groups?
Yes.
Okay. Hmm.
I think we paid them $50 an hour.
I volunteer.
And I want to say that our unique combination of having the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy, as well as architecture planning and design, and the community healthy communities lab was another sort of a mixed interdisciplinary group on campus that worked together to have a coalition sponsoring the conversation and driving it forward was very important. I think coalitions are critical, especially if you can combine them from not just the social service agencies, but from getting people in universities who offer studying resources together with people who are really advocates, as well as, if you can possibly do it, groups that are kind of on the private sector side, commercial side of the equation. If the basic driver is a coalition, it's less likely for people to back off and say, "Oh, well, I don't have anything to do with that. Homelessness is not my issue." That's probably a good combination to start looking for. And maybe you guys already have coalitions. To know what coalitions or partnerships have been most effective in pursuing your advocacy.
For the balance of state, we actually help coordinate local homeless coalitions. And right now, 1, 2, 3. Is Jen on the call? She could give me the number. I think we have like 29 spread across the balance of state. And I know that's not even all of them. Those are just the ones we're aware of.
Who are officially in continuous partnership together.
Mm-hmm.
And
some are single counties, some are actually just a whole area.
Okay. How do you look at the supply side to demand side continuum in your participation? Because of course we were looking at housing, and there were a whole lot of developers and property managers who would say, "Well, this is what we do," and as well as social service agencies. How do you engage people who are on more the supply end of that spectrum?
That is a good question. A lot of our communities have different resources set in place, so a lot of them are responding and reacting in multiple different ways. Like here in Austin, we can look at foundation communities and recreate that model. But of course, all these tax streams that foundation communities is using for these low-income units isn't available everywhere else. So it is kind of based on rarity and scarcity. Coming into the chat, Denise says the city has to be on board. Billy says learn to speak their language, which for sure. But I do want to be cognizant of time. We're about down to 1 minute. So if this is the power question, let's hit it hard.
Ooh.
Yes, I will get this recording posted to our YouTube as fast as possible. I will send y'all the follow-up materials that y'all requested as soon as we're done with this call. For everybody else on the line, last minute chance for questions. Other than that, I want to thank Katie, Sush, and Donna so much. Practice has been fun. This presentation has been awesome. I have so many notes I
I'm
have to go
trying
to
to find
review
out
now.
who's talking right
I
now.
also need to
Somebody
look
said
at.
they were from Austin, and I didn't catch it. I think it's. I didn't. I don't know. And then who are you? Are you?
That's me. Our office is based in Austin.
Got it. Okay,
Oh,
perfect.
hi.
Yeah,
I'm Craig. I'm the COC programs coordinator with
Yeah,
THN.
I missed the beginning of the meeting, so I'm pretty sure there's a couple introductions.
I probably should have started with that.
But I would definitely, I appreciate the information, and I would love to attend the follow-up if y'all have it, and also view the recording.
It's okay. For sure. For those that are still on the line, about 15 minutes after we end this, a thank you email will come through with a survey. So please let us know all your thoughts, all your questions, all your queries, because we do love to look at that data. Of course, I will share it with the presenters as soon as I get a hold of it too. But it is now 3:31. I bid you adieu. Have a good afternoon. If it's hot, I wish it cooler. If it's cooler, I wish it warmer.
Keep up your hard work.
Thank you. Same to you. Thank y'all. Oh, thank you.